Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Facts channel. I'm so glad you found your way here. Maybe you had a long day, or maybe you're the kind of person who likes falling asleep to gentle underwater mysteries rather than counting sheep. Either way, tonight's journey is for you. Let your mind relax, your breathing slow, and your body grow light as seagrass swaying in warm coastal currents. Because tonight, we're exploring manatees, those peaceful giants who drift through tropical waters like living clouds. We'll drift from their serene movements to their ancient history, discovering how these gentle herbivores have perfected the art of slow living. Some of what you hear tonight may surprise you, or at least spark curiosity as you drift off. Before we begin, if this helps you unwind, consider liking and subscribing, one sleepy soul at a time. Now, let's begin. The manatee moves through water with grace that belies its massive body. This gentle giant weighing up to 1,300 pounds, yet gliding through coastal waters and rivers, with the ease of a creature born to float, the manatee's movements being unhurried and deliberate, each motion economical and purposeful. The manatee belongs to an ancient lineage of marine mammals. These creatures having evolved from land-dwelling ancestors over 50 million years ago, gradually adapting to aquatic life while retaining certain features that reveal their terrestrial origins, including fingernails on their flippers and lungs that require the animal to surface regularly for breath. The manatee is one of only 4 surviving species in the order Sirenia, this group being named after the mythical sirens of ancient Greek legend, sailors supposedly mistaking these rotund grey animals for beautiful mermaids, though this seems unlikely given the manatee's appearance. The confusion perhaps arising from glimpses of manatees nursing their young while floating upright in water, or from the loneliness and delirium of long ocean voyages creating visions where none existed. The manatee's scientific name, Trichechus, comes from Greek words meaning 3 and nail, referring to the 3 or 4 vestigial fingernails visible on each flipper, these nails being remnants from the time when the manatee's ancestors walked on land, the nails serving no apparent function in modern aquatic life, but persisting as evolutionary echoes, reminders of a distant terrestrial past. The manatee drifts through warm waters, its presence being calm and reassuring, the animal embodying patience and gentleness, moving through the aquatic world without aggression or hurry, the manatee being content to simply exist, to breathe and eat and float, living a life of remarkable simplicity in waters that humans share but rarely understand. The manatee's body is perfectly designed for aquatic herbivory, the rounded form providing buoyancy, while the paddle-shaped tail propels the animal forward with lazy sweeps, the flippers serving primarily for steering and for manipulating food. Though manatees sometimes use their flippers to walk along the bottom in shallow water, the animals appearing to crawl in slow motion across sandy or muddy substrates. The manatee's skin is thick and wrinkled, being gray to brown in color and often appearing greenish due to algae that grow on the skin surface. This algal growth being harmless and actually providing some camouflage, making manatees blend with the murky waters they inhabit. The algae also serving as food for small fish and invertebrates that pick at the manatee's skin, creating a mobile ecosystem that travels wherever the manatee goes. The manatee's head is large and rounded, featuring a blunt snout covered with stiff whiskers called vibrissae, these sensory hairs being extremely sensitive to touch and water movements, allowing the manatee to detect food and to navigate through murky water where visibility is limited. The vibrissae covering not just the snout, but also the entire body, creating a tactile sense that supplements the relatively poor vision. The manatee essentially feeling its way through the underwater world. The manatee has no external ears, the ear openings being small holes, barely visible behind the eyes. Yet the manatee's hearing is excellent, the animal being able to detect sounds across a wide range of frequencies, communicating with other manatees through chirps, squeaks, and whistles that carry through water, these vocalizations being particularly important between mothers and calves who maintain almost constant vocal contact. The manatee's nostrils sit on top of the snout. these valves closing tightly when the manatee submerges, opening only when the animal surfaces to breathe. The manatee typically surfacing every 3 to 5 minutes during active periods, though being capable of remaining submerged for up to 20 minutes when resting. The breathing being automatic but conscious, the manatee choosing when to surface rather than breathing reflexively, like terrestrial mammals do while sleeping. This conscious breathing being a trait shared with other marine mammals including whales and dolphins. The manatee is completely herbivorous, feeding exclusively on aquatic plants, including seagrass, algae, and freshwater vegetation. The animal consuming between 4 and 9% of its body weight in vegetation daily, this massive intake being necessary because plant material is relatively low in nutrients compared to animal tissue, requiring the manatee to feed for many hours each day. The manatee's teeth are unique among mammals, the molars being replaced continuously throughout life, in a process similar to that of elephants and kangaroos, new teeth forming at the back of the jaw and slowly moving forward as front teeth wear down and fall out. This tooth replacement allowing the manatee to process tough, abrasive vegetation throughout its life, without the dental problems that would afflict animals with fixed dentition. The manatee lacks front teeth, using instead a split upper lip to grasp vegetation. This prehensile lip being able to manipulate plants with remarkable dexterity, pulling up rooted vegetation or stripping leaves from stems. The lip working in coordination with the flippers to bring food to the mouth, where the grinding molars process it into digestible material. The manatee's digestive system is extremely long, the intestines measuring over 100 feet in length and requiring significant time to extract nutrients from plant material, food taking approximately 1 week to pass completely through the digestive tract. This slow digestion being similar to that of terrestrial herbivores, like cows, though without the multiple stomach chambers that ruminants possess, the manatee having instead a simple stomach and relying on intestinal fermentation to break down cellulose. The manatee's slow metabolism matches its leisurely lifestyle, the animal having one of the lowest metabolic rates of any marine mammal. This low metabolism being partly why manatees require warm water, their bodies generating insufficient internal heat to maintain body temperature in cold conditions, making them vulnerable to cold stress when water temperatures drop below 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The manatee feeds in shallow water where light penetrates and allows aquatic plants to grow, the animal being most commonly seen in waters less than 10 feet deep. Though manatees occasionally dive deeper, the animals being flexible in their habitat use and going wherever food is available, the manatee being patient and methodical in its feeding, moving slowly through vegetation beds and consuming vast quantities without apparent hurry, the animal demonstrating that a peaceful existence requires adequate nourishment, that gentleness does not preclude the work of survival. The manatee's relationship with humans has been complex and often tragic, these gentle animals having no natural defenses against modern threats, making them vulnerable to boat strikes, habitat loss, and entanglement in fishing gear. Though legal protection has helped some populations recover from the brink of extinction, the manatee shows remarkable tolerance of human presence, often approaching swimmers and boats with curiosity rather than fear. This bold behavior sometimes leading to harmful interactions when people attempt to touch or feed the animals, such contact being illegal in most jurisdictions because it habituates manatees to humans and makes them more vulnerable to boat strikes. The scars on most adult manatees tell stories of boat encounters, the propeller marks creating distinctive patterns on backs and tails, biologists using these scar patterns to identify individuals and track their movements over time, each manatee bearing a unique signature of its interactions with human activities, the scars being testament to the animal's resilience, but also to the dangers they face in waters increasingly dominated by motorized vessels. The manatee population in Florida numbered perhaps several thousand when Europeans arrived, plummeting to fewer than 1,500 animals by the 1970s due to hunting, habitat loss, and boat strikes, protection under the Endangered Species Act, and the establishment of protected areas, allowing populations to recover slowly to current numbers. exceeding 8,500 individuals, though the species remaining vulnerable to threats that continue to affect survival and reproduction. The manatee inspires protective feelings in many who encounter them. The animal's gentle nature and apparent vulnerability, creating emotional connections that translate into conservation support. Numerous organizations working to protect manatee habitat, reduce boat speeds in critical areas, and rescue injured animals. This conservation effort being ongoing and requiring continued vigilance to ensure that manatee populations remain viable. The gentle giants serving as ambassadors for coastal conservation, reminding humans that our activities affect other species and that we bear responsibility for protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The manatee's closest living relatives are not other marine mammals but rather elephants and hyraxes. These three groups sharing a common ancestor that lived millions of years ago, the relationship being surprising given the vast differences in appearance and lifestyle. Yet genetic analysis confirming the connection, revealing that manatees and elephants are evolutionary cousins. The manatee evolved from four-legged land mammals that gradually adapted to aquatic life, the fossil record showing intermediate forms that inhabited coastal areas and spent increasing amounts of time in water, eventually losing their hind legs entirely, while the front legs transformed into flippers. The tail evolving from a standard mammalian tail into the horizontal paddle that provides propulsion. This evolutionary journey, taking millions of years, and producing an animal superbly adapted to aquatic herbivory. The extinct Steller's sea cow was the largest sirenian, reaching lengths of over 30 feet and weighing up to 20,000 pounds. This Arctic species having evolved thick blubber to survive in cold northern waters, living in kelp forests around islands in the Bering Sea, until being hunted to extinction within 30 years of its discovery by Europeans in 1741. The species serving as a cautionary tale about the fragility of isolated populations and the devastating impact that humans can have on species that evolved without mammalian predators. The manatee's evolutionary history includes periods of much greater diversity, fossil evidence revealing numerous extinct species that occupied various aquatic niches, the modern survivors representing only a small fraction of the Sirenian radiation that once flourished, the current species being remnants that have persisted while many relatives disappeared. The manatee, carrying within its genes the legacy of millions of years of aquatic adaptation, the animal being a living link to ancient seas and to evolutionary processes that shaped life on Earth. The gentle giant, swimming through modern waters, while bearing the accumulated wisdom of countless generations of ancestors who perfected the art of aquatic grazing. The manatee's habitat includes rivers, estuaries, and coastal waters throughout the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, the Amazon River system, and the west coast of Africa. These warm water regions providing the temperature and vegetation that manatees require, the animals being unable to survive in waters that remain cold year-round despite their marine lifestyle. The Florida manatee migrates seasonally in response to temperature changes. Individuals moving south in winter to find warm water refuges, often congregating around natural springs that maintain constant temperatures, or near power plant outflows, where heated water creates artificial warm zones. These aggregation sites, sometimes hosting hundreds of manatees during cold spells. The animals packed together in relatively small areas where they remain until temperatures rise sufficiently for dispersal. The manatee establishes no permanent territories, individuals roaming over large areas in search of food and suitable conditions, home ranges varying from just a few miles to over 200 miles depending on the season and the distribution of resources. Some individuals remaining relatively sedentary, while others undertake extensive movements, the variation in ranging behavior reflecting different strategies for dealing with environmental challenges and resource availability. The manatee favors shallow coastal areas with abundant seagrass beds. These highly productive habitats providing concentrated food resources and allowing the manatee to feed efficiently, though the animals also utilize freshwater rivers and springs, demonstrating flexibility in habitat use that allows them to exploit diverse aquatic environments. The manatee being equally comfortable in saltwater, brackish water, or freshwater. Their kidneys being adapted to handle varying salinity levels. This physiological flexibility being rare among marine mammals and allowing manatees to access resources unavailable to species restricted to full-strength seawater. The manatee's presence indicates healthy aquatic ecosystems. The animals requiring abundant vegetation and relatively clean water, their distribution therefore mapping the remaining pockets of high-quality coastal habitat, the manatee serving as an indicator species whose well-being reflects the overall health of coastal environments, the gentle browser being dependent on environmental conditions that benefit many other species as well, making manatee conservation efforts provide broader ecosystem benefits. The manatee's swimming is surprisingly graceful despite its bulk, the animal being neutrally buoyant and moving with minimal effort, the paddle tail providing forward thrust, while the flippers steer and stabilize. The manatee typically cruising at speeds of 3 to 5 miles per hour, though capable of brief bursts, up to 15 miles per hour when startled. The manatee rolls and turns with fluid movements, the body being flexible enough to allow complete barrel rolls and tight turns. The animal sometimes swimming upside down or vertically, playing in the water column with apparent enjoyment. These acrobatic displays being particularly common in manatee calves, who seem to experiment with the possibilities of three-dimensional movement, the young animals learning the physical capabilities of their bodies. Through play, the manatee spends most of its time either feeding or resting, the daily routine being divided between these activities with little else, the animal having no need to search actively for prey or to engage in territorial disputes. The manatee's life being remarkably free of stress and conflict, this peaceful existence being possible because their food is stationary and abundant in the right habitats, and because adult manatees have essentially no natural predators except humans. The combination of plentiful food and safety, allowing a lifestyle focused entirely on eating and resting, the simplicity of manatee existence being almost meditative in its singular focus. The manatee rests by lying on the bottom in shallow water, or by hanging suspended in the water column, the animal remaining motionless except for periodic trips to the surface for breath, these resting periods allowing digestion and conserving energy for the next feeding session, the rests sometimes lasting for hours, the manatee being patient beyond human comprehension, content to simply exist without entertainment or stimulation, the animal finding sufficiency in the simple fact of being alive and comfortable, floating in warm water, with a full stomach being apparently all the satisfaction a manatee requires. The manatee communicates through various vocalizations that sound like squeaks, chirps, and whistles when heard by human ears. These sounds serving primarily for maintaining contact between mothers and calves, though adults also vocalize during social interactions. The calls being produced by the larynx and modified by nasal passages, creating sounds that carry well through water and allow manatees to remain in contact even when visibility is poor. The mother and calf maintain almost constant vocal communication, the pair exchanging calls that allow them to locate each other in murky water or when separated by vegetation. This vocal tether being essential because young calves cannot dive as long as adults and might become separated if they lose contact with their mothers. The vocalizations providing reassurance and allowing coordination of activities. The gentle exchanges between mother and calf being touching examples of parental care in marine mammals. The manatee's hearing extends to both low and high frequencies, allowing detection of boat motors at considerable distances, though manatees often fail to avoid oncoming boats, perhaps because they cannot determine the direction boats are approaching from, or because they habituate to boat noise in heavily traveled areas and stop responding to warnings, this failure to avoid boats being a major cause of manatee mortality, despite their good hearing. The paradox of having the sensory ability to detect danger, but lacking the evolutionary history that would create appropriate avoidance responses. The manatee produces sounds during various activities, feeding being accompanied by contentment vocalizations that might communicate satisfaction to nearby individuals, while disturbance or discomfort triggering different calls that alert other manatees to potential problems. The vocal repertoire being simple compared to dolphins or whales, but adequate for the manatee's social needs. The animals not being highly social beyond the mother-calf bond, but maintaining awareness of others in their vicinity and occasionally interacting during meetings at popular resting or feeding sites. The manatee's vision is relatively poor compared to dolphins or seals, the eyes being small and lacking the sophisticated adaptations that some marine mammals possess for seeing in dim underwater environments. Manatees instead, relying more heavily on touch and hearing to navigate and find food, the visual system being adequate for detecting large objects and for distinguishing light from dark, but not providing the detailed perception that characterizes visual predators. The manatee's eyes can move independently to some degree, allowing the animal to monitor different directions simultaneously. Though the utility of this is limited by the poor visual acuity, the manatee essentially having peripheral awareness without much fine detail, the world appearing to the manatee as shapes and shadows rather than as the crisp images that humans experience. The manatee compensates for poor vision through its remarkable tactile sense. The thousands of vibrissae covering the body detecting water movements and allowing the animal to sense nearby objects even in complete darkness. These sensory hairs being so sensitive that manatees can detect and respond to gentle currents and to the movements of other animals. The tactile world being rich and detailed, despite the visual world being murky and indistinct. The manatee experiencing its environment through touch in ways that humans can barely imagine. The manatee navigates through familiar areas using memory and landmarks, learning the locations of good feeding grounds, warm water refuges, and safe resting spots. This spatial memory, allowing efficient movement through home ranges, without requiring constant exploration. The manatee knowing its territory intimately and being able to move purposefully toward desired locations rather than wandering randomly. The mental map being based on tactile and acoustic cues more than visual ones, demonstrating that navigation need not depend on sight, that other senses can provide sufficient information for an animal to know where it is and where it wants to go. The manatee exhibits gentle social behaviors that reflect its peaceful nature. Animals sometimes gathering in loose groups at favored sites, though not forming the tight-knit societies that characterize dolphins or whales. The manatee's social system being flexible and based more on convenience than on long-term bonds. Individuals coming together when conditions favor aggregation, then dispersing when they move on to other activities. The manatee shows no aggression toward other manatees, conflicts being resolved through avoidance rather than confrontation. The animals apparently lacking territorial instincts beyond personal space, individuals tolerating the close presence of others when gathered at warm water refuges, though maintaining some distance when possible. The gatherings being peaceful assemblies rather than competitive scrums, the manatees coexisting harmoniously, without apparent hierarchy or dominant struggles. The manatee engages in what appears to be playful behavior, animals sometimes rubbing against each other or engaging in slow-motion chases that seem to serve no purpose beyond simple enjoyment. These interactions being most common among calves, but occurring occasionally in adults as well, suggesting that manatees experience something akin to pleasure or satisfaction from physical contact and movement. The play being gentle and unhurried, matching the overall temperament of these peaceful animals. The manatee investigates novel objects with gentle mouthing and manipulation, using its flexible lips and sensitive whiskers to explore unfamiliar items. This curiosity being potentially dangerous when the objects are human artifacts like rope or debris that could cause entanglement or injury. Though the investigative behavior itself is endearing, revealing an animal that experiences the world with openness and interest rather than fear or aggression. The manatee's interactions with other species are generally benign, the animals showing no predatory interest in fish or invertebrates and being largely ignored by most other aquatic species, though small fish sometimes pick parasites from manatee skin and birds occasionally hitch rides on floating manatees, these commensal relationships being based on the manatee's tolerance and the benefits that other species derive from proximity to these gentle giants, the manatee being host to a suite of hangers-on who benefit from association without apparently affecting the manatee negatively, creating mobile ecosystems centered around individual animals who drift through coastal waters, providing services to smaller creatures without seeming to notice or care. The manatee's reproductive rate is remarkably slow, females typically producing a single calf every 2 to 5 years, this low reproduction being balanced by high survival rates among adults who face few natural threats. Once they reach full size, the population dynamics being characterized by long lifespans and slow population growth, making recovery from population declines take decades rather than years. The manatee calf is born after a gestation period of approximately 12 to 14 months, the single offspring being large at birth, typically weighing 60 to 70 pounds and measuring over 3 feet long, the calf being able to swim immediately and reaching the surface for its first breath within minutes of birth, though remaining dependent on its mother for nourishment and protection for the first year or two of life. The mother and calf form an extremely close bond, remaining together constantly during the first few months. The calf nursing, frequently while learning to supplement milk with vegetation. The transition from milk to plants being gradual, with the calf beginning to nibble vegetation at a few months old but continuing to nurse for over a year. The extended nursing period reflecting the long development time required to learn what plants are good to eat and how to process them efficiently. The manatee calf grows slowly, reaching sexual maturity at 5 to 7 years of age for females and somewhat later for males. This delayed maturity being another factor that limits population growth, the animals investing heavily in each offspring and taking years to replace themselves, making every calf precious and its survival critical for population maintenance. The manatee displays no parental care beyond the mother-calf bond, males having no involvement in raising young and showing no recognition of their offspring, the entire burden of calf rearing falling on females who must provide nourishment, protection, and education for their young, while maintaining their own body condition and health. This maternal dedication being essential for species persistence and representing a significant energetic investment that limits how often females can successfully reproduce. The manatee faces numerous modern threats. Despite legal protection, boat strikes, remaining the leading cause of mortality in areas like Florida, where manatee habitat overlaps with heavy recreational and commercial boating traffic. The collisions being often fatal or causing severe injuries that reduce the animal's ability to feed, dive, or escape future threats. The manatee's habitat continues to degrade through coastal development, pollution, and climate change. Seagrass beds declining in many areas due to nutrient runoff that causes algae blooms, the algae blocking light and preventing seagrass growth, reducing the food available to manatees and forcing them to travel farther to find adequate nutrition. The habitat loss being insidious and less visible than boat strikes, but potentially more threatening to long-term population viability. The manatee sometimes becomes entangled in fishing gear or marine debris, the animals lacking the dexterity to free themselves from ropes or nets that wrap around flippers or tails. Entangled individuals either drowning if they cannot surface to breathe, or suffering chronic wounds and infections from lines cutting into flesh, the entanglement problem being preventable through proper disposal of fishing gear and reduction of marine litter. The manatee is vulnerable to cold stress during unusual weather events, extended periods of cold weather, causing deaths, particularly among smaller individuals who have less thermal mass and lose heat more rapidly than large adults. Cold-stressed manatees becoming lethargic and weak, unable to feed properly. The animals sometimes succumbing to hypothermia or to secondary infections that exploit their weakened condition. The manatee benefits from ongoing conservation efforts including habitat protection, boat speed restrictions in critical areas, rescue and rehabilitation programs for injured animals, and public education aimed at reducing human-caused mortality. These multifaceted approaches being necessary because no single intervention is sufficient. The manatee's survival, depending on addressing multiple threats simultaneously and maintaining vigilance as new challenges emerge. The gentle giant requiring human guardianship to persist in waters that have become more dangerous through our activities. The responsibility for protecting manatees resting squarely with the humans who share their habitat and whose actions determine whether future generations will experience the wonder of encountering these peaceful creatures. The manatee's skin is home to a diverse community of organisms, including algae, barnacles, and various microscopic creatures. This living coating, transforming each manatee into a mobile habitat that provides substrate for species that would otherwise lack attachment surfaces in open water, the relationship being largely commensal, with the hitchhikers benefiting while the manatee appears unaffected by their presence. The algae that grows on manatee skin is primarily freshwater or marine species depending on where the manatee has been spending time, the algal covering sometimes being so thick that it obscures the natural gray color of the skin, making manatees appear greenish-brown, this coloration providing some camouflage in murky coastal waters, while also indicating the animal's recent movements. Freshwater algae, suggesting the manatee has been in rivers or springs, while marine algae indicating time spent in saltwater environments. The manatee occasionally engages in behavior that appears designed to clean its skin, rubbing against dock pilings, rocks, or the hulls of boats. These scratching sessions, possibly providing relief from itching caused by algae or parasites, or perhaps simply feeling pleasant, the animals sometimes spending extended periods rubbing and rolling, appearing to take satisfaction from the activity. The behavior suggesting that manatees experience physical sensations beyond simple survival needs, and perhaps enjoy tactile stimulation for its own sake. The barnacles that attach to some manatees are typically found on individuals who spend significant time in salt water. These crustaceans, finding purchase on the rough skin and filtering food from water flowing past as the manatee swims, the barnacles being small and seemingly causing no harm, though their presence must alter the hydrodynamics of swimming to some degree, adding roughness and drag that presumably costs the manatee some efficiency, though not enough to motivate removal attempts. The manatee's bones are unusually dense compared to most mammals. This pachyostosis, helping the animal maintain neutral buoyancy without needing large amounts of fat for flotation, the dense bones acting as ballast that counterbalances the buoyancy provided by the lungs and by gases in the digestive system, allowing the manatee to hover effortlessly in mid-water without sinking or floating, the animal achieving perfect equilibrium through skeletal density rather than through active swimming. The manatee's ribs are particularly thick and heavy, lacking the marrow cavity that characterizes most mammal bones. Instead, being solid throughout their cross-section, this solidity providing the ballast function, while also offering some protection to the internal organs. Though the ribs are not articulated in ways that would allow the chest to expand and contract for breathing, the manatee instead, using diaphragm and abdominal muscle movements to draw air into and expel air from the lungs. The manatee's skeleton has been modified extensively from the terrestrial mammal template, the hind limbs having been lost entirely, except for vestigial pelvic bones, buried within the body wall, these remnant bones serving no apparent function and being merely echoes of the terrestrial ancestry, while the forelimbs have been transformed into flippers that retain the basic pentadactyl structure of 5 fingers, visible beneath the skin as bones that support the flipper blade, the fingers being splayed and connected by tissue to create a paddle, the presence of fingernails on some individuals being additional evidence of the ancestral hand structure. The manatee's spine is extremely flexible, allowing the animal to bend and twist its body. This flexibility being particularly evident in the neck region, where manatees can turn their heads much more freely than most marine mammals. The neck vertebrae not being fused as they are in cetaceans, giving manatees head mobility that dolphins and whales lack. This mobility, allowing manatees to look around while remaining relatively stationary, to reach vegetation at different angles while feeding, and to maintain visual and tactile contact with their environment, without needing to reposition their entire bodies. The manatee's heart beats slowly compared to smaller mammals, the resting heart rate being typically 40 to 60 beats per minute. This bradycardia being characteristic of large animals whose circulatory systems need not pump as rapidly to circulate blood through bodies where diffusion distances are large, but where metabolic rates are relatively low. The slow heartbeat being sufficient to meet the manatee's modest oxygen demands. The animal's lifestyle requiring minimal exertion and therefore allowing a leisurely cardiovascular pace. The manatee's circulatory system includes adaptations for diving. Though manatees are not deep or long-duration divers like seals or whales, the animals typically remaining submerged for only a few minutes and rarely diving deeper than 20 feet. The diving adaptations being modest and primarily involving the ability to shunt blood away from peripheral tissues toward vital organs during submersion, ensuring that the brain and heart receive priority when oxygen becomes limited. The manatee's blood has a high oxygen carrying capacity relative to terrestrial mammals, though not as high as true diving specialists. This enhanced oxygen transport, allowing the animal to remain submerged longer than lung volume alone would suggest, the blood acting as an oxygen reservoir that supplements the air held in the lungs, extending dive duration without requiring large lung capacity that would create excessive buoyancy problems. The manatee's respiration is consciously controlled, the animal deciding when to surface and breathe rather than breathing reflexively, as terrestrial mammals do. This voluntary breathing requiring that manatees remain semi-conscious even during rest, never entering the deep sleep that would cause breathing to stop. The manatee's rest, therefore being lighter than terrestrial mammal sleep, the animal remaining aware enough to surface when needed. This wakeful resting being, similar to the situation in cetaceans, who face the same challenge of being conscious breathers, living in an environment where unconsciousness would mean drowning. The manatee's digestive system includes a large cecum, where bacterial fermentation breaks down the cellulose in plant cell walls. This microbial digestion being essential because mammals lack the enzymes needed to directly digest cellulose. The bacteria performing this service in exchange for the habitat and nutrients that the manatee's gut provides. This symbiotic relationship being critical for extracting nutrition from aquatic plants. The manatee's gut bacteria must be acquired after birth, calves obtaining their microbial community through contact with the mother and through consuming small amounts of her feces. This transmission of beneficial bacteria being necessary because the microbial species needed for digestion are not present in the environment and cannot colonize the gut without being introduced by a host who already harbors them, making the mother-calf bond important not just for nutrition and protection but also for microbial inheritance. The manatee produces copious amounts of gas as a byproduct of bacterial fermentation, this gas being released regularly through flatulence that creates streams of bubbles rising to the surface, the gas production being a normal consequence of the fermentation process, and actually serving a useful function by contributing to buoyancy, the gas in the intestines, helping the manatee maintain neutral buoyancy without requiring additional energy expenditure for staying suspended in the water column. The manatee's feces are produced continuously throughout the day, as the digestive system processes the constant input of vegetation, the waste being released as discrete pellets that sink to the bottom or float briefly before sinking. These fecal deposits distributing nutrients through the environment and supporting populations of detritivores and decomposers. The manatee's waste being an important nutrient source in some coastal ecosystems, where manatee populations are dense enough to produce significant inputs of processed organic matter. The manatee's teeth are replaced throughout life in a continuous conveyor belt system, new molars forming at the back of the jaw and gradually moving forward as older teeth at the front wear down and fall out, this tooth replacement occurring in both upper and lower jaws, ensuring that the manatee always has functional grinding surfaces for processing vegetation, the replacement rate being fast enough that worn teeth are shed before they become completely ineffective, maintaining the animal's ability to feed efficiently throughout its life. The manatee typically has 6 to 8 molars visible on each side of each jaw at any given time, though the total number of teeth that pass through the jaw during a lifetime may exceed 100 per jaw quadrant. This continuous replacement being unusual among mammals and being shared primarily with elephants, who face similar challenges of processing abrasive plant material that wears teeth rapidly. The manatee's molars are relatively simple in structure, having 2 transverse ridges that create grinding surfaces. These ridges meeting when the jaws close and crushing plant material between them, the teeth lacking the complex cusps and folds that characterize some herbivores. The simple structure being adequate for the manatee's diet, which does not include particularly tough or woody vegetation. The seagrass and aquatic plants that manatees eat, being soft enough to be processed by relatively simple teeth. The rate of tooth replacement increases when manatees feed on particularly abrasive vegetation or when they inadvertently consume sand along with plants. The increased wear stimulating faster tooth movement and replacement, this responsiveness, ensuring that the animal maintains adequate dental function regardless of variations in diet composition or feeding conditions. The tooth replacement system being one of the manatee's most remarkable adaptations, solving the problem of dental wear in a way that few other mammals have achieved. The manatee's lips are highly mobile and split into left and right sections that can move independently, this prehensile upper lip being used to grasp vegetation and manipulate it toward the mouth, the lip sections working together or separately to pull up plants, strip leaves from stems, or sort through mixed vegetation to select preferred items. The dexterity of the lips being remarkable and being the primary means by which manatees handle food, since their flippers lack the articulation needed for fine manipulation. The manatee uses its flippers in coordination with its lips to feed, the flippers holding or positioning vegetation while the lips grasp and tear, the 2 systems working together to allow efficient feeding on a variety of plant types and growth forms. The manatee being able to feed on bottom-rooted plants, on floating vegetation, and on plants attached to hard substrates. The flexibility of feeding behavior, allowing exploitation of diverse food sources. The manatee's whiskers on the snout are not just sensory organs but also play a role in feeding, helping to locate vegetation through touch and to guide it toward the mouth. These vibrissae, being dense around the lips and being in constant motion during feeding, sweeping across surfaces and probing into crevices, the whiskers extending the animal's reach and allowing it to find food that might not be immediately visible in murky water. The manatee feeds while oriented in various positions, sometimes feeding right side up from the bottom, sometimes rolling partially or completely inverted to reach vegetation on the undersides of floating mats or overhanging banks. The animal being flexible enough to twist and turn as needed to access food from different angles. This positional flexibility being enabled by neutral buoyancy that eliminates the need to maintain any particular orientation relative to gravity, allowing the manatee to literally turn its world upside down when convenient. The manatee's daily time budget is divided primarily between feeding and resting, with feeding occupying 6 to 8 hours per day in most populations, the exact amount varying with season, water temperature, and food quality. Higher quality food, requiring less feeding time, while low-quality vegetation, necessitating longer feeding sessions to meet nutritional requirements. The manatee's feeding schedule shows no strong daily pattern, animals feeding at all hours of day and night, though some individuals show preferences for feeding during particular time periods. These preferences being idiosyncratic rather than species-typical. Some manatees feeding primarily during daylight, while others feed mainly at night. The variation suggesting that feeding timing is not driven by strong environmental or physiological constraints, but rather by individual habit or local conditions. The manatee rests between feeding bouts. These rest periods typically lasting 2 to 12 hours depending on various factors including water temperature, digestive state, and recent activity levels. the rests being periods of minimal movement, when the manatee either lies on the bottom in shallow water or hangs suspended in mid-water, surfacing periodically to breathe but otherwise remaining nearly motionless, the stillness being profound and suggesting a state of deep relaxation, if not actual sleep. The manatee's activity patterns change with season. Winter periods, when manatees are concentrated in warm water refuges, being characterized by more resting and less feeding compared to summer, when animals are dispersed and actively foraging. This seasonal shift, reflecting both the energetic costs of thermoregulation in cooler water and the reduced food availability in crowded winter aggregation sites, where many animals compete for limited vegetation. The manatee's thermoregulation abilities are limited compared to most marine mammals, the animal lacking the thick blubber layer that insulates seals and whales, instead relying on a relatively thin layer of fat beneath the skin. This minimal insulation making manatees vulnerable to cold stress when water temperatures drop below their comfort range. The manatee's lower critical temperature is around 68 degrees Fahrenheit, below which the animal must increase its metabolic rate to maintain body temperature. This increased metabolism requiring more food intake at a time when the animal may be eating less due to cold-induced lethargy, creating a dangerous positive feedback where cold stress reduces feeding, which leads to weight loss, which further reduces the ability to maintain body temperature. The manatee responds to cold stress by seeking warm water refuges, these thermal havens being natural springs that maintain constant temperatures around 72 degrees regardless of air temperature, or artificial warm water sources like power plant discharges that create zones of heated water, manatees congregating at these sites during cold weather and remaining there until ambient water temperatures rise enough to allow safe dispersal. The manatee's dependence on warm water refuges makes it vulnerable to changes in availability of these critical habitats. The retirement of old power plants, potentially eliminating warm water sources that manatees have used for decades, requiring management actions to ensure that adequate thermal refuges remain available, particularly as climate change creates more frequent, extreme weather events, including unusually cold periods that stress manatee populations. The manatee shivers when cold stressed, this muscular activity generating heat but consuming energy reserves. Prolonged shivering, leading to weight loss and weakening, cold-stressed animals becoming lethargic and showing reduced responsiveness, floating passively rather than feeding actively. The cold stress syndrome being a major cause of mortality during unusual weather events, particularly affecting young, old, or already compromised individuals who have less thermal mass or reduced physiological reserves. The manatee's range has shifted over evolutionary time in response to climate changes and sea level fluctuations. The fossil record showing sirenians living in areas now too cold for manatees, suggesting that past warm periods allowed these animals to occupy higher latitudes, while glacial periods presumably restricted them to more tropical refuges, the current distribution representing an interglacial configuration that might shift again as climate continues changing. The manatee's dispersal abilities are limited by temperature constraints, the animals being unable to colonize temperate or cold waters. Despite these areas often having abundant aquatic vegetation, the thermal barrier being absolute and preventing range expansion beyond tropical and subtropical zones, where water remains warm year-round or where warm water refuges exist to provide winter shelter. The manatee shows some evidence of site fidelity, individuals returning to the same feeding areas, resting spots, and warm water refuges year after year. This fidelity, suggesting spatial memory and learned knowledge about habitat quality. The animals apparently remembering locations of good resources and preferentially returning to places that have proven reliable in the past. This traditional use of particular sites, making those locations critically important for conservation. The manatee's movements are influenced by numerous factors, including temperature, food availability, salinity, water level, and reproductive state. The animals integrating this information to make decisions about where to go and when. The decision-making process being flexible, and allowing individuals to respond to changing conditions. Some manatees showing predictable seasonal patterns, while others having more nomadic lifestyles that take them to different areas in different years. The variation in movement strategies, suggesting that there are multiple viable approaches to being a manatee. The manatee's interaction with its physical environment extends beyond simple inhabitation, the animals modifying habitats through their feeding activities, creating trails through seagrass beds, and maintaining open areas where repeated grazing prevents vegetation from growing densely. These feeding trails being used by manatees and by other species who benefit from the maintained pathways. The manatee's grazing can stimulate seagrass growth when grazing pressure is moderate, the removal of older leaves, allowing light to reach younger growth, and removing accumulated algae that would otherwise shade and suppress the grass. This positive effect being similar to the way that terrestrial grazers can enhance grassland productivity through appropriate levels of herbivory. The manatee's excavation of vegetation sometimes creates pits in soft sediments. These depressions collecting organic matter and creating microhabitats that differ from surrounding areas, potentially benefiting some invertebrate species while disadvantaging others. The manatee's physical disturbance creating heterogeneity in otherwise uniform seagrass beds. The manatee's movements through shallow water create currents and disturbances that suspend sediments and redistribute nutrients. The animals acting as biological mixing agents that prevent stratification and stagnation, particularly in confined areas where water exchange is limited. The manatee's presence creating movement and flow that benefits the aquatic community by improving oxygen distribution and nutrient availability. The manatee's sensory world is dominated by touch and hearing, these senses providing the primary information that guides behavior, while vision plays a supporting role, the animal experiencing its environment as a landscape of textures, temperatures, water movements, and sounds, rather than as the visual scene that humans emphasize. The manatee's whiskers detect water movements created by other animals, by currents, and by waves. This hydrodynamic sensitivity, allowing the animal to sense its surroundings, even in complete darkness or in murky water where visibility is zero. The whiskers creating a tactile image of nearby space that updates continuously as water flows across the sensitive hairs. The manatee's skin sensitivity extends beyond the whiskers, the entire body surface being responsive to touch and to temperature, the animal apparently able to detect subtle temperature gradients and to orient toward warmer water. This thermal sensitivity being critical for finding warm water refuges during cold weather, the manatee following temperature cues toward springs or other warm sources. The manatee's acoustic sensitivity allows detection of approaching boats, waves breaking on shore, and the vocalizations of other manatees, these sounds providing information about the environment and about social opportunities. The underwater soundscape being rich with information for an animal equipped to detect and interpret acoustic cues. The manatee integrates information from multiple senses to build a coherent understanding of its surroundings. Touch, hearing, and vision each contributing pieces of information that together create the manatee's subjective experience. The world as perceived by a manatee being fundamentally different from the world humans know, reminding us that there are many ways to experience reality, and that our visual-centric perception is just one possibility among many. The manatee's brain is relatively small compared to body size, though not unusually small when compared to other herbivorous mammals of similar body mass, the brain being smooth-surfaced with fewer folds than the brains of more cognitively complex species like primates or cetaceans. This smooth structure, suggesting that manatees do not engage in particularly complex cognitive tasks. The manatee demonstrates learning and memory in various contexts. Individuals learning the locations of food sources, warm water refuges, and travel routes. Remembering these locations across seasons and years, this spatial learning being essential for efficient use of resources distributed across large home ranges. The manatee shows recognition of other individuals, mothers and calves, recognizing each other through vocalizations and possibly through other cues, this recognition persisting even after periods of separation, suggesting that manatees form memories of specific individuals and can maintain these memories long-term. The manatees' problem-solving abilities appear limited, the animals showing little innovative behavior and relying primarily on instinct and learned routines rather than on flexible problem-solving, though this apparent simplicity might reflect limited testing rather than actual inability, our understanding of manatee cognition being based on relatively few studies. The manatee's behavior suggests a creature living primarily in the present moment, responding to immediate needs and conditions rather than planning far ahead, the animal's life being governed by simple rules about when to eat, when to rest, where to find warmth, and how to stay comfortable. This simplicity being perhaps the secret to the manatee's peaceful existence, the animal being unburdened by worry about the future or regret about the past. Simply existing in the eternal now, eating when hungry, resting when sated, moving toward comfort and away from discomfort, the manatee's life being meditation in animal form. The manatee's population recovery in Florida demonstrates that conservation can succeed when appropriate protections are implemented and maintained. Populations increasing from the low point in the 1970s to current levels that prompted reclassification from endangered to threatened status, though threats remain and continued protection is necessary to prevent backsliding. The manatee's success story is not complete or guaranteed. The animals still facing significant threats and requiring ongoing management and protection, the population remaining vulnerable to unusual events like extended cold spells or disease outbreaks that could cause rapid declines, the conservation challenge being to maintain protections during good times so that populations can weather the bad times that inevitably occur. The manatee serves as an umbrella species whose protection benefits entire coastal ecosystems. Conservation measures implemented for manatees, including habitat protection, water quality improvement, and boating regulations also benefiting countless other species that share manatee habitat. The charismatic gentle giant being a flagship that rallies public support for broader conservation efforts. The manatee's conservation has been supported by extensive research that has revealed the species' biology, ecology, and population dynamics. This scientific foundation, allowing informed management decisions and helping identify priorities for protection efforts. The investment in research, paying dividends in the form of more effective conservation. The manatee's future depends on continued public support for conservation, funding for protection programs, enforcement of regulations, and willingness to modify human activities to accommodate wildlife needs. These social and political factors being ultimately more important than biological factors in determining whether manatees persist or decline. The gentle giant's fate being in human hands, the manatee inspires affection in many who encounter them, the animal's gentle demeanor and apparent vulnerability, creating emotional connections that translate into conservation support. Numerous manatee rescue organizations working to rehabilitate injured animals and to protect habitat. This grassroots conservation being motivated by genuine care for the animals, rather than by abstract concern for biodiversity or ecosystem function. The manatee has become a cultural icon in Florida and other parts of its range, appearing on license plates, in art, and in educational materials. This cultural prominence, raising awareness, and creating a constituency for conservation. The manatee, being fortunate to have physical characteristics and behavior that humans find appealing, rather than threatening or disgusting. The manatee's appeal crosses demographic boundaries. Children and adults, scientists and laypeople, locals and tourists, all responding positively to manatee encounters. This broad appeal, creating diverse support for conservation that spans political and social divisions. The gentle giant, bringing people together around shared appreciation for these peaceful creatures. The manatee's story illustrates both the threats that human activities pose to wildlife and the potential for successful conservation, when societies choose to prioritize protection, the animal being both victim and beneficiary of human choices. The manatee's current status, reflecting decades of conservation effort and ongoing commitment to sharing space with wildlife. The gentle giant reminding us that we can choose to be good neighbors to other species, that we can modify our activities to reduce harm, that conservation is possible when we care enough to make it happen. The manatee's ancestors left the land millions of years ago, gradually adapting to aquatic life through changes in body form, physiology, and behavior, this evolutionary journey being reflected in the manatee's anatomy, which combines aquatic adaptations with remnants of terrestrial ancestry, the animal being neither fish nor fully marine mammal but something in between, a creature perfectly adapted to its particular niche, but carrying evidence of its evolutionary history. The manatee's closest living relatives provide context for understanding Sirenian evolution. Elephants and hyraxes, being terrestrial herbivores whose ancestors diverged from the Sirenian lineage tens of millions of years ago, the three groups sharing a common ancestor, but having evolved in radically different directions, demonstrating evolution's ability to produce dramatically different forms from common starting points. The manatee represents just one surviving lineage from what was once a more diverse group. Numerous extinct Sirenian species having occupied various niches in past oceans, some being larger, others smaller, some inhabiting different regions. The modern manatees and dugong being the fortunate survivors, while many relatives disappeared during past extinction events or environmental changes. The manatee's evolutionary success lies in its specialization for aquatic herbivory in warm, shallow waters. This niche being stable enough to support Sirenians for millions of years, despite climate fluctuations and other environmental changes, the animals finding sufficiency in their chosen lifestyle, evolving refinements rather than radical changes, perfecting the art of being aquatic grazers rather than diversifying into new ecological roles. The manatee's conservatism being a successful strategy that has allowed persistence through geological time. The manatee's presence in an area indicates environmental health, these animals requiring relatively clean water with abundant vegetation, their distribution therefore mapping the remaining high-quality coastal habitats, the gentle browsers serving as indicator species whose well-being reflects broader ecosystem conditions. The manatee's sensitivity to pollution varies by pollutant type, the animals being affected by toxins that accumulate in vegetation or that directly impact their physiology, harmful algal blooms, sometimes producing toxins that affect manatees who consume contaminated plants. These red tide events causing respiratory distress and sometimes mortality, particularly when blooms are intense and prolonged. The manatees being unable to avoid toxic areas when those areas overlap with critical habitat. The manatee's exposure to human pharmaceuticals and industrial chemicals occurs through contamination of aquatic environments. These substances entering waterways through sewage discharge and runoff, accumulating in vegetation and sediments where manatees feed. The long-term effects of chronic low-level exposure being largely unknown, though potentially affecting reproduction, immune function, or other physiological systems. The manatees being unwitting participants in a massive uncontrolled experiment regarding the effects of environmental contamination on wildlife. The manatee's thick skin provides some protection against external parasites and minor injuries, though offering no defense against boat propellers or the chronic effects of pollution. The skin being tough enough to resist casual abrasion, but being vulnerable to the concentrated forces of modern threats. The manatee's evolutionary history, having prepared it for the challenges of the natural world, but leaving it defenseless against the novel hazards that humans have introduced to its environment. The manatee's buoyancy control is achieved through a combination of dense bones, lung volume adjustment, and intestinal gas production, these three factors being balanced to achieve neutral buoyancy that allows effortless hovering in mid-water, the animal being able to adjust its position in the water column through subtle changes in lung inflation or through releasing intestinal gas. This fine control, allowing the manatee to maintain desired depth without active swimming. The manatee's lungs extend along most of the body length, rather than being confined to the chest cavity, as in terrestrial mammals. This elongated lung structure, distributing buoyancy along the body and helping maintain horizontal trim, preventing the head-down or tail-down orientations that would result from having all the buoyancy concentrated in one area. The lung shape being an adaptation for neutral buoyancy rather than for efficient gas exchange. The manatee's breathing is visible from above as the nostrils break the surface, the exhalation creating a small fountain or spray, followed immediately by inhalation, the entire breathing cycle taking only a few seconds before the animal submerges again, this brief surface time, minimizing exposure to sun and to aerial predators, though the latter being essentially non-existent in the manatee's range. The quick breathing being a holdover from ancestry, or simply being efficient behavior that minimizes time away from feeding or resting. The manatee's dive reflex causes heart rate to decrease when the animal submerges. This bradycardia, conserving oxygen by reducing the metabolic demands of the heart muscle itself, though the effect is modest compared to deep-diving seals or whales, reflecting the manatee's shallow diving lifestyle, which does not impose the same physiological challenges that true divers face. The manatee's cardiovascular system being adequate for its needs, without requiring the extreme adaptations that characterize animals who routinely dive to great depths for extended periods. The manatee's relationship with fresh water is complex. The animals being able to drink fresh water and actually requiring it for maintaining proper salt balance, though they can survive on the water content of vegetation when fresh water is unavailable, their kidneys being capable of concentrating urine to conserve water, though not to the same degree as truly marine species like dolphins or whales. The manatee seeks out freshwater sources, including springs, rivers, and areas where rainfall creates temporary freshwater lenses floating on denser saltwater, these freshwater drinking sites being important resources that attract manatees, particularly during dry periods when freshwater availability is limited. The manatee's osmoregulatory system must handle varying salinity, depending on whether the animal is in freshwater, brackish water, or full-strength seawater, the kidneys and other organs adjusting their function to maintain proper salt and water balance, this physiological flexibility being rare among marine mammals and allowing manatees to exploit environments that are inaccessible to species restricted to either fresh or salt water. The manatee's ability to move between freshwater and saltwater may have evolved to allow exploitation of seasonal resources, rivers providing abundant vegetation during wet seasons, while coastal areas offering winter refuges. The flexibility to move between these environments, allowing year-round access to required resources. The manatee's lifestyle, depending on having access to both freshwater and marine habitats at different times, or being able to transition between them as conditions change. The manatee's growth continues throughout life, though slowing dramatically after reaching sexual maturity, adults continuing to add length and weight as they age, the oldest individuals being the largest, this indeterminate growth being characteristic of many fish and reptiles, but being unusual among mammals who typically stop growing at maturity. The manatee's continued growth, perhaps reflecting its relatively low metabolism and the absence of the hormonal changes that typically stop growth in mammals. The manatee's age can be estimated from growth layers in ear bones, these bones accumulating annual layers similar to tree rings, though reading these layers requires specialized techniques, and the correlation between layer count and age being imperfect, making precise age determination difficult, our understanding of manatee longevity being based on known age individuals from captivity and from long-term studies of marked wild animals. The manatee can live 60 years or more based on records from captive animals, wild longevity being presumably somewhat less due to accidents, disease, and other hazards, though some wild manatees bearing scars from injuries decades old. demonstrating that long lifespans are possible in nature, not just in the protected environment of captivity where food is provided and threats are minimized. The manatee's slow growth, late maturity, and long lifespan are characteristics of what biologists call K-selected species. These organisms investing heavily in each offspring and living in relatively stable environments, where adult survival is high. This life history strategy, working well in undisturbed conditions, but making populations vulnerable to sudden increases in mortality. The animals being unable to rapidly replace losses through increased reproduction, recovery from population crashes requiring decades rather than years. The manatee's vocalizations have been studied through underwater recordings, revealing a repertoire of sounds more complex than casual observation might suggest. The calls varying in frequency, duration, and pattern, different call types, possibly conveying different information. Though the meaning of most vocalizations remaining unknown, researchers having identified general contexts for calling, but not having deciphered the detailed message content. The manatee calf's vocalizations change as it matures. Infant calls being higher pitched and more frequent than adult calls. This ontogenetic change, reflecting physical growth of the vocal apparatus, as well as changing social needs. Calves needing constant contact with mothers, while adults being more solitary and requiring less frequent communication. The manatee's hearing extends to frequencies above those produced in their own vocalizations, suggesting that they can detect sounds from other sources, including those produced by predators or by environmental features. Though the extent to which manatees use passive listening for environmental awareness, rather than just for social communication, remains unclear. Most research focusing on the social sounds that manatees produce, rather than on the full range of sounds they can detect. The manatee's vocal communication is supplemented by visual and tactile cues when animals are in close proximity. Mothers and calves touching frequently, these physical contacts providing reassurance and maintaining the bond. Adults occasionally engaging in gentle rubbing or nuzzling during social encounters, the tactile communication being particularly important given the limited visibility in many manatee habitats where visual signals would be difficult to detect beyond arm's reach. The manatee's response to human presence varies among individuals and populations, some animals being quite bold and approaching swimmers or boats with apparent curiosity, while others being more cautious and maintaining distance. This variation reflecting different experiences with humans, individual personality differences, or perhaps learned behavior transmitted from mother to calf. The manatee's apparent friendliness toward humans may be a liability rather than an asset. Habituated animals being more vulnerable to boat strikes because they do not avoid vessels, and tame behavior, encouraging illegal touching or feeding that can alter natural behavior patterns and create dependencies on human provisioning. The manatee's use of marinas, boat basins, and other artificial structures demonstrates their adaptability, the animals finding suitable habitat in areas modified by humans, sometimes even preferring artificial sites that provide shelter, fresh water, or concentrated food sources. This flexibility, allowing manatees to persist in developed areas, though also exposing them to boat traffic and other hazards. The manatee's coexistence with humans requires management of human behavior rather than management of manatee behavior, the animals simply going about their natural activities, while humans must modify their actions to avoid harming manatees. Speed zones and protected areas, placing restrictions on human activities, rather than attempting to train or relocate manatees. This approach, recognizing that manatees cannot be expected to adapt to threats that evolution did not prepare them for, the responsibility for avoiding conflict falling on the more cognitively sophisticated species who can understand and implement protective measures. The manatee's role in their ecosystems extends beyond simple herbivory, the animals influencing nutrient cycling through their digestion and excretion, concentrating nutrients from vegetation into their feces, which are then deposited throughout their range. This redistribution, moving nutrients from feeding areas to resting areas, and potentially fertilizing vegetation in areas where manatees spend time. The manatees' feeding selectivity means that they impact some plant species more heavily than others, potentially altering vegetation, community composition through preferential grazing on favored species. Though the magnitude of this effect varies with manatee density and with the resilience of plant communities, some vegetation recovering rapidly from grazing, while other species being more sensitive to herbivory. The manatee's excavation of vegetation and sediment creates disturbance that some species benefit from, while others are disadvantaged, the net effect of manatee activity on biodiversity being difficult to predict without detailed study, the animals likely having both positive and negative effects on different components of the ecosystem, their overall impact being neutral, or perhaps slightly positive when populations are at moderate levels. The manatee's presence attracts tourists and researchers, bringing economic activity and attention to coastal areas. This economic value, creating incentives for habitat protection that benefit many species beyond manatees. The charismatic herbivore, being a driver of conservation that provides umbrella benefits to less visible or less appealing species, sharing the habitat. The manatees' migration patterns show fidelity to particular routes and destinations. Individuals returning to the same winter warm water sites year after year, traveling along preferred pathways that may follow coastlines or river channels. This traditional behavior suggesting cultural transmission of migration knowledge from mother to calf, young animals learning where to go by accompanying their mothers on their first migrations. The manatee's timing of migration is triggered by water temperature, animals beginning to move toward winter refuges. When temperatures drop below comfort levels, the migration being gradual rather than sudden, individuals departing over a period of weeks rather than all leaving simultaneously. The staggered departure, reflecting individual variation in temperature tolerance and in the urgency of reaching warm water. The manatee's spring dispersal from winter refuges is similarly gradual. Animals leaving warm water sites as ambient temperatures rise, the dispersal spreading the population across available habitat, rather than everyone remaining concentrated in the refuge areas. This seasonal expansion and contraction of range, being annual rhythm, that has likely persisted for as long as manatees have inhabited Florida and other areas with seasonal temperature variation. The manatees' migration routes sometimes include areas where human activities create hazards, channels, and waterways, being both convenient travel corridors and dangerous zones where boat traffic is concentrated, the animals having little choice but to run the gauntlet through these areas to reach necessary habitats, conservation requiring that these corridors be made as safe as possible through speed restrictions and through education of boaters about manatee presence. The manatee's status as a marine mammal is technically incorrect, since they inhabit coastal waters and rivers rather than the open ocean, the term aquatic mammal being more accurate, though marine mammal being commonly used despite the imprecision. The manatee being grouped with seals, whales, and dolphins, despite occupying quite different habitats and having different evolutionary histories. The manatee's aquatic adaptations are less extreme than those of cetaceans or pinnipeds, the animals retaining more terrestrial characteristics, including visible neck, mobile front flippers with individual digits, and less streamlined body form. These features, reflecting the manatee's recent evolutionary transition to water, compared to whales who have been aquatic for tens of millions of years longer, giving cetaceans more time to develop extreme adaptations, while manatees retain more ancestral features. The manatee's evolutionary pathway from land to water followed a different trajectory than cetaceans, Sirenians apparently having always been herbivorous and shallow water specialists, while cetacean ancestors being predators who followed prey into progressively deeper water, these different ecological pressures producing different suites of adaptations, explaining why manatees and whales look and behave so differently despite both being aquatic mammals. The manatee represents an independent experiment in marine mammal evolution, showing that there are multiple solutions to the challenge of living in water. The cetacean solution, involving speed, deep diving, and echolocation, while the Sirenian solution involving slow movement, shallow water, and herbivory, these different approaches being equally valid and successful in their respective contexts. Evolution producing diversity through multiple pathways, rather than converging on a single optimal form. The manatee's conservation status varies geographically. Florida manatees being relatively well studied and protected, while populations in other countries receiving less attention and facing different threats. Some populations being stable or increasing while others declining. The global picture being mixed and requiring region-specific conservation approaches rather than one-size-fits-all solutions. The manatee's survival in areas with less conservation infrastructure depends on local attitudes toward wildlife, on economic alternatives to activities that harm manatees, and on education about the animal's importance and vulnerability. Conservation in developing nations facing challenges that differ from those in wealthier countries, the solutions needing to address human needs as well as wildlife needs. Recognizing that impoverished people cannot be expected to prioritize wildlife conservation over their own survival. The manatee benefits from international cooperation. The animals moving between countries in some parts of their range, requiring coordinated protection across political boundaries, treaties and agreements being necessary to ensure that conservation in one country is not undermined by lack of protection elsewhere. The gentle giants needing advocates who work across borders to implement comprehensive protection throughout their range. The manatee's future on a warming planet is uncertain. Climate change bringing both threats and possible opportunities. Warmer water, expanding potential habitat in some areas, while raising temperatures above optimal in others. The net effect being difficult to predict, though the loss of natural warm water springs through geological changes or increased frequency of extreme weather events, posing concerns that may outweigh any benefits from general warming trends. The manatee's intelligence is difficult to assess using standard measures developed for more cognitively complex species. The animals showing little interest in the puzzle-solving tasks that dolphins or apes excel at, though this lack of engagement, perhaps reflecting different cognitive styles rather than lower intelligence. Manatees being adapted for a lifestyle that does not require complex problem-solving or tool use. The manatee demonstrates clear capacity for learning and memory. Individuals remembering locations across years and learning to avoid certain areas after negative experiences. This learning ability being adequate for the manatee's ecological needs and suggesting a cognitive capacity appropriate for their lifestyle, even if not impressive by human standards. The manatee shows some evidence of play behavior, particularly in calves who engage in apparently purposeless rolling, chasing, and object manipulation. This play suggesting that manatees experience something beyond simple stimulus response, that they have internal states that include something like enjoyment or curiosity, though whether this subjective experience is similar to human emotion being unknowable, we can observe the behavior, but can only speculate about the accompanying feelings. The manatee's cognitive abilities are probably underestimated due to limited research. Few studies having investigated manatee intelligence systematically, most research focusing on more immediately practical questions about population size, threats, and habitat use, the animals' mental lives remaining largely unexplored territory that future research may reveal to be richer than currently appreciated. The manatee's future depends on continued evolution of human attitudes and behaviors, the animals needing humans to recognize their value and to modify activities that cause harm. This requirement for human behavioral change being the central challenge of conservation, biological knowledge being necessary but not sufficient, the ultimate success or failure, depending on social and political will to implement and maintain protective measures. The manatee serves as a test of our commitment to coexistence with wildlife, the animals making modest demands on human society, requiring mainly that we operate boats carefully in their habitat, maintain water quality, and protect seagrass beds, these requirements being eminently achievable if we choose to prioritize them. The gentle giants, asking only for space to live their peaceful lives, not competing with humans for resources or threatening our safety. The manatee's persistence, despite decades of human pressure, demonstrates remarkable resilience, populations recovering when given protection and habitat. The animals showing that conservation can work. That species can rebound from low numbers if threats are addressed before reaching the point of no return. This success story providing hope and serving as model for recovery of other threatened species. The manatee embodies gentleness. In a world that often rewards aggression, the animal's peaceful lifestyle and inoffensive nature being almost revolutionary in their simplicity. The manatee suggesting that there are alternatives to competition and conflict, that a life of calm, grazing, and peaceful coexistence is viable and perhaps even admirable. The gentle giant floating through warm waters, teaching us that success does not require domination, that contentment can be found in simple pleasures, that there is dignity in gentleness. The manatee's scientific study has revealed much, but many mysteries remain. Researchers still discovering new aspects of their biology and behavior. Each answered question generating new questions, the accumulation of knowledge being an ongoing process that will likely continue for decades, perhaps revealing surprising capabilities or behaviors that current understanding does not anticipate. The manatee's communication system may be more sophisticated than currently appreciated, the possibility existing that their vocalizations convey more information than researchers have decoded, or that manatees use other communication channels that humans have not detected. Our understanding being limited by our sensory capabilities, and by the difficulty of interpreting signals from species whose lives are so different from our own. The manatee's navigation abilities remain poorly understood. The animals traveling long distances and returning to specific locations. The mechanisms they use for navigation being unknown, whether they remember landmarks, follow gradients in water properties, use some form of magnetic sense, or employ other cues being subjects for future research. The gentle travelers keeping their wayfinding secrets. The manatee's social intelligence may exceed what brief encounters suggest. Long-term relationships between individuals being possible but difficult to detect with current research methods. The animal's social lives potentially being richer than the apparently simple gatherings at warm water refuges would indicate more intensive study, perhaps revealing complexity currently hidden. The manatees' adaptations for their lifestyle are so complete that they make inefficient terrestrial animals, the modifications for aquatic life having come at the cost of land mobility, the evolutionary commitment to water being essentially irreversible. Manatees being as dependent on aquatic environment as fish, unable to return to land even temporarily, their ancestors' terrestrial adaptations having been so thoroughly modified that no route back exists. The manatee's body temperature regulation through environmental rather than internal heat production makes them dependent on external warmth. This reliance on environmental conditions being vulnerability, but also being freedom from the energetic costs of endothermy, allowing the low metabolic rate that supports their peaceful lifestyle. The trade-off being acceptable in environments where adequate warmth is reliably available. The manatee's specialization for herbivory on aquatic plants limits potential for dietary flexibility, the animals being unable to switch to other food sources if vegetation becomes unavailable. This dietary restriction, making them vulnerable to changes in plant communities, but also making them excellent at exploiting their chosen food, the specialization being strength and weakness simultaneously, allowing efficiency within a narrow niche, while limiting options when conditions change. The manatees' lack of natural defenses beyond simple avoidance makes them vulnerable to novel threats. Evolution, having not prepared them for predators that hunt with motorboats or for environmental contamination. The gentle nature that serves them well in natural settings, becoming liability when facing human-created hazards. The manatees' trust and approachability, being charming but dangerous. In a world where not all encounters are benign, the manatee drifts through its world with enviable peace. The animal apparently unburdened by anxiety or restlessness, living in the moment without apparent concern for past or future. This present-focused existence being something many humans aspire to, but struggle to achieve. The manatee naturally embodying the mindfulness that meditation seeks to cultivate. The manatee's simplicity is profound rather than simple-minded. The animal having distilled life to its essentials of eating, resting, and reproducing, eliminating complications and living with purpose that is clear and unambiguous. The gentle herbivore showing that a good life need not be complex, that satisfaction can come from meeting basic needs in pleasant surroundings. The manatee's gentleness extends to all aspects of behavior. These animals showing no aggression toward their own kind or toward other species, living peaceably with neighbors and causing no harm, the manatee being proof that gentleness is viable, that peaceful creatures can persist and thrive, that aggression is not prerequisite for survival, despite nature's reputation for violence. The manatee moves through water like meditation given physical form, each motion deliberate and unhurried. The animal flowing rather than forcing, accepting currents rather than fighting them. The manatee's movement being lesson in efficiency and acceptance. The gentle giant, demonstrating that resistance is often unnecessary, that working with natural forces rather than against them creates grace and conserves energy. And now the manatees fade behind your thoughts. We've drifted through 100 quiet truths about these gentle giants, from their peaceful grazing in shallow, warm waters to their ancient evolutionary journey from land to sea, from their remarkable tooth replacement to their vulnerable dependence on warmth, from their whispered communications to their patient migrations, from their healing scars to their hopeful recovery. You are connected to this world. The same waters that cradle manatees connect to oceans that touch every shore. The same sunlight that warms their habitat warms your skin. The same evolutionary processes that shaped manatees over millions of years shaped your own ancestors. These gentle creatures remind us that there are many ways to live successfully, that gentleness and peace are viable strategies, that slow and steady can thrive, that aggression and competition are not the only paths. Tonight, as you rest, manatees continue their timeless routines in warm tropical waters. They drift through seagrass meadows, grazing peacefully with flexible lips, selecting tender shoots. They surface every few minutes, breathing briefly before submerging again, their lives measured in breath cycles and feeding sessions. They rest on sandy bottoms or hang suspended in clear springs, bodies perfectly buoyant, perfectly still, perfectly content. Mothers call softly to calves, who answer with chirps of recognition. Old males bearing propeller scars drift past younger animals who swim unscathed. The gentle giants ask nothing of us but space and care, the chance to continue their peaceful existence in waters we share. And you are safe, warm, resting in a world still graced by these remarkable animals, where manatees still graze seagrass beds, where mothers still teach calves the locations of warm springs, where evolution's gentle experiment in aquatic herbivory continues, where patience and peace demonstrate their worth, where gentleness persists despite a world that sometimes forgets its value. Sleep now, knowing that in warm waters south of here, manatees float and feed and rest, living their simple, profound lives, teaching us through example that serenity is possible, that contentment can be found in simple pleasures, that grace flows from acceptance rather than from struggle. These gentle giants, being ambassadors of peace in a world that often forgets that such peace exists, their slow movements and quiet lives being poems written in water, hymns to gentleness, testaments to the beauty of living softly in this world. If you're still awake, go ahead and watch the next chapter. Sleep well and dream softly. Good night.